Ericka Huggins, you last graced our airways in 2012, and it's a pleasure to have you back. As an elder and long-term revolutionary, you have a lot to teach, especially in this time of the national uprising against structural racism and police murders, as well as the 50th anniversary of the first Gay Pride March in New York City that's being celebrated in a queer liberation march for Black lives and against police brutality. So I'd like to start by having you provide our listeners with a capsule history of the early years of your political work, particularly in the Black Panther Party in Los Angeles, which you joined in 1967 at age 18 and became a leader of that chapter along with your husband, John Huggins. Could you talk about that process of deciding to join the party and what you did before John was murdered, what kind of work you did in the party? Just give us a little flavor of what it was like being in the party.
Okay, so Bob, thank you for having me on the show. I really appreciate it. And I know that Stamili will be joining as a co-host in a little while. Thank you, Stamili. And thank you to John, who's doing the technical work. Thank you to everybody at Out FM. I appreciate you bringing me back. In answer to your question, I joined the Black Panther Party because when I read about it, the purpose was said to be to change the conditions of life for all poor and oppressed people. And growing up Black in Washington, D.C., I knew that that meant Black people as well as brown people, as well as indigenous people. And that touched my heart. That's why I wanted to join. And I wanted to be in an organization that wasn't being behind the scenes run by people who wanted us to wait, to say it differently, to use strategies that work for them, but not for us. I was young and I felt like this was an important organization to be a part of. Now, at that time, in the world, everything was moving. Everything, everybody around the globe. White women were standing up for their own agency. We were all against the war in Vietnam. Indigenous peoples organizations, Latino organizations, student organizations. And as a matter of fact, the Black Panther Party created the Black Student Union concept, which spread across the country and around the world as a way students could organize. And there were just so many organizations forming. And I felt like since I met so many of those coinciding identities that I should join too. And my friend, John Huggins, who became my partner and then my husband, and we have a child together, said that he wanted to leave the historical Black university that we were attending and join the Black Panther Party. I wanted to do the same thing. So we drove across the country from the East Coast, from New York City to Los Angeles, because that was as far as our gas money would lead us. We couldn't get to Oakland. And we were young and really open-hearted and open-minded and thought we would see revolution in our lifetime. When we got to Los Angeles, we did not find the chapter of the Black Panther Party right away, but eventually we did. And we also went back and forth in terms of party work. We went back and forth in that little car of John's to Oakland, California, which is at least a 6-hour drive. And one of the things that we all knew, anybody who was anywhere near any Black or brown or indigenous community knew that police brutality was a top priority for transformation, not just change. As we're looking at it now, we're looking at transforming the work that police do, but we were looking at it then. And so the patrols of police was not to harm police, but to protect community. The original name of the Black Panther Party was the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense.
Mm-hmm.
And self-defense is misunderstood, but not by people of color. It's misunderstood because it means taking care of oneself and loved ones. And so the Breakfast for Children program was self-defense.
Mm.
The People's Free Medical Clinics are self-defense. The end to mass incarceration is self-defense. And looking out for people when they're being arrested against the law is self-defense. Asking police officers why they're arresting someone who didn't seem to have done anything. And I witnessed this as a little girl in the neighborhood I lived in Southeast Washington, D.C., all the time. This wasn't just an adult understanding. This was something I'd seen all my life. I knew that self-defense was a proper response to violent behavior supported by violent structures. So when we joined the Black Panther Party in November of 1967, we were asked if we could answer phones. We were asked if we could sell the party's newspaper, which had a huge global readership, about events and movements around the world. We were asked if we could cook a meal when asked, each of us, and a couple of other questions, and we both said yes. And the young man who welcomed us so kindly said, "Okay, y'all are Panthers then." And it was a sweet moment because there wasn't some huge screening interview or some way that we had to fit criteria. We just had to be willing to serve. Of course, looking back in hindsight, some screening would have helped us a little bit, I want to say, just a little bit, in combating the atrocities of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's counterintelligence program. Yet another violent expression of violently racist structures set up in society and paid for by taxpayers. So we did everything we could. And also John and I both spoke to people who asked us to join them in their homes, in their schools, wherever they were, and to talk about the need for Black liberation. So Bob, does that answer your question?
Yes, beautifully. And, thank you for those great insights into what was so remarkable and just kind of world changing about the Black Panther Party at the time and ever since. So I now want to turn to a much more painful chapter in your involvement with the party, which directly involves what you raised a couple of minutes ago, and that is the FBI's counterintelligence program, or COINTELPRO. And that is that on January 17th, 1969, your husband, John Huggins, was assassinated by gunfire on the UCLA campus, along with fellow Black Panther and also a friend of yours as well, Alprentice Bunchy Carter. While the police immediately claimed that the shooters were part of a so-called rival Black nationalist group, the truth later came out. It was uncovered that these assassinations, as well as 28 others that happened across the U.S. Over a 2-year period, had been orchestrated as part of COINTELPRO. And the memo authorizing COINTELPRO by the FBI put it quite bluntly. They said it's designed to, quote, expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize, unquote, the activities of not only the Black Panther Party, but a range of radical and progressive groups. But of course, the Black Liberation Movement was the central target. So Ericka Huggins, can you talk about the murder of your husband and your comrade Bunchy Carter, and what it meant to you, what it meant to your 3-month-old daughter, and to the movement more broadly?
Well, thank you for that question. It was a painful time in my history, but it was also generally a painful time in history, as is today a painful time in history. And it's almost 55 years later. So I want to say that things didn't just happen on that day. As you read that really frightening purpose statement of the counterintelligence program, which started as a clandestine organization within the FBI, started, by harassing and surveilling labor movement workers, and then Martin Luther King, and then all other movements, anything that moved. I'm thinking about what Mahatma Gandhi said about hate. He said I'm paraphrasing, but he said it isn't really hate. What we experience at the root of hate is really fear. And so it was that fear that was ruling the FBI in creating and sustaining and adding informants and agent provocateurs to the work of COINTELPRO, paid for by taxpayers' money, as I said earlier. In other words, my mother's taxes went into their work. John's mother and father's taxes went into their work. When you think about that, it's not only frightening, but again, it is violent. And I'm going to mention the term violence a lot in this interview because Black and poor people, people of color particularly, are often in sentences where the adjective is violent group, violent people, violent protests. But we live in a country that is conceived in violence. The Holocaust of Native peoples, indigenous people, the stealing and enslaving of African people. So here we are on January 17th, 1969, in the daytime on the UCLA campus. And before that, 8 members, maybe 7 members of the Black Panther Party had been killed. So for me, it meant that I pulled out my black dress and went to a funeral. And because we worked 19-hour days, I had never had a chance to grieve. We didn't really have the opportunity to grieve because it was as if we were living in war, though no one wanted to call it that. So that day, I got a call from a person in the party office saying that John had been killed. He didn't say that John had been killed. He said 2 comrades were shot on the UCLA campus. And I intuited that they were John and Bunchy right away. because of their work to support two Black student organizations on campus, maybe more. And I didn't think that students had killed John and Bunchy at all. I hung up the phone after confirming with my friend who called that they died. And he said yes, and I said thank you. And there was this really tender silence. To know John was to be in the presence of lightheartedness and joy and just pure generosity. And to know Bunchy was to be in the presence of royalty, of openness. He taught many of us, having taught himself in prison, he taught many of us not only about African American history, but African history, which is never given to children in school. Never. And so he was a natural leader. Again, we were very young. The median age of members of the Black Panther Party was 19 years old. I was 18 when I joined. And on that day, John, who was 23, and Alprentice Bunchy Carter, who was 26, were assassinated by the government. It changed my life forever. These were my dearest friends at the time. Bunchy was like a big brother, and John was my touchstone. He was my friend. He was also my comrade and the father of my daughter. So in that moment, I became a single mom and a widow. That's how it impacted me. And how did it impact the world? How did it impact the Carter family, the Huggins family, my daughter, Bunchy's son and daughter? It impacted us in exponential ways. And when those shots rang out and killed them, it became obvious that people had to look once again more carefully at the structures in place that allow for the value of Black lives, of lives of people of color, to be dismissed.
That's so powerful, Ericka.
Thank you.
That's so powerful. And it's very interesting how you've made the connection from then to now, in the language that we're using today.
Yes.
Of dismissing and devaluing the lives of Black people, and the level of violence that the state is willing to exact on us for whatever measures, to disrupt our organizations, to disrupt solidarity, and to disrupt just to kill us.
Yes, thank you for saying that. What does your name mean? It's so beautiful.
It's Kiswahili, it means patience.
And right now, we're all exhibiting a lot of that, aren't we? We're always exhibiting patience and compassion and empathy. And that's what is needed in our world. I wanted to let you know something, that when I talk to school children a lot, it's my favorite thing to do. Because they don't ask questions that make you work hard. They just ask questions. It's so pure. So I was talking to some 4th and 5th graders one day, and they asked me, they had been studying the Black Panther Party in school because they had this outstanding teacher who got them elementary school level books to read that went over the history of the civil rights and human rights movements in the United States. And they'd read about COINTELPRO. Never had I met any fifth graders who had read about COINTELPRO.
Mm.
And so since they had, and since they heard that part about disrupt, discredit, and further neutralize Black liberation movements and any movements, anything that moved, as I said earlier, I asked them what they thought the word neutralize meant, because it's an interesting word. And this little boy with deep brown eyes and a soft face said at the top of his voice, he was probably 10. He said, "It means kill, Miss Ericka, it means kill." Now, there are people who hear that word and they don't get that when you neutralize something in science, you change it at a molecular level.
Mm-hmm.
You rid the world of whatever it is. You get rid of it. And I think that no longer, I'm speaking of now in 2020, so many people who were inured to this level of violence cannot continue to do so because, I'm sorry to say, they have witnessed the murder of George Floyd. They've heard the stories of Eric Garner and Sandra Bland. They know that Breonna Taylor was in her bed when she was killed. So now people whose lives aren't touched by this kind of violence are suddenly awake. And it must be confusing. But we need to hustle past confusion and step up and talk to one another. Have conversations that are honest and meaningful rather than depending upon people of color to do that by themselves.
Appreciate that, sis.
All right. Well, moving on to another painful episode of your life, but this one turned pain into triumph. Within 3 months of the murder of John Huggins, you accompanied his body back to New Haven, Connecticut, where he had grown up, and were asked by Black community activists and Yale students to form a chapter of the Black Panther Party in that city. And in short order, both you and Black Panther Party chair at the time, Bobby Seale, faced federal charges of conspiracy, kidnapping, and murder. You were imprisoned without bail for 14 months, both before and during your trial. And then both of you were acquitted of all charges by a predominantly white jury. And again, it became clear later that the FBI had orchestrated the case against the two of you. It was yet another frame-up. So can you talk about that whole experience, the charges, the time in prison, the trial, and what lessons you learned from it?
Well, how much time do we have? So first, I want to make a correction. In the last interview I did with you, and you recounted it in your question, in the last interview, I said that I traveled with John's body. I followed John's body to Connecticut.
Okay.
His body had already been delivered to his family, and I was going to join them. And I was on a train. Thank goodness for that train, because I had 3 days just to be with my 3-week-old baby at the time. She was 3 months old when I was arrested. I had time just to be with her and to think about what had just happened and to acknowledge the grieving process, not just the grief of John and Bunchy's deaths, but all the others. And I want to say all the others dating back to my ancestors. And and how this has become normalized, that yet another young widow gets in some transportation and goes to join family for a funeral. But it was a pleasure to be welcomed and received by the Huggins family, because for me, the reason was that there was my baby daughter, John's baby daughter. And so by me coming there, I could hand to them, his mother particularly. My heart goes out to all the mothers. I just want to say that right out loud.
Mm-hmm.
My heart goes out to all the mothers who have to endure this unnatural, violent end to their babies' lives. But I handed over my living, healthy baby to Mrs. Huggins, and she held on, and she was happy for a moment. So after a little while being there, the members of the New Haven Black community and some of the Yale students asked me to say and start a chapter of the Black Panther Party in New Haven, and I said yes. And so I was intending to go back to Oakland in a few weeks, where the national headquarters of the Black Panther Party was seated. And we had, by the way, over 45 chapters of the Black Panther Party in the United States. And then chapters of the Black Panther Party were being replicated around the world. And so I stayed and I started the chapter. And within 2 months, by the time my daughter was 2.5 months, by the time my daughter was 3 months old, I was arrested, as you said, Bob, for conspiracy with the intent to commit murder. A murder was committed. I did not commit it. Bobby Seale did not commit it, nor did we conspire to commit this murder. And this murder was supported by the FBI and the local New Haven Police Department. John had grown up in New Haven, Connecticut, which, by the way, for those of you who don't understand our cities in the United States, even if, for instance, the city of New Haven may look like Yale is its center, for me, the center were the Black and brown communities in New Haven, as it would be in New York or Oakland or DC or Boston or any of the other places. So we started organizing to create a breakfast for children program. We had in mind to create a clinic. That didn't happen because this murder of this very young African-American man who was never a police informant was, we were told that that's what he was, and he was killed. That whole period is such a painful period in my life. And again, I can't imagine what it meant for his mother. This man happened to be the most gentle man quiet, and I think I've ever met. So we were not allowed bail. There were 14 of us arrested, and the people who were supported by the FBI and the New Haven Police Department to kill him were separated from us and kept in another prison. Bobby Seale was in the male prison. I was in the women's prison. And the other people arrested were let go. There was no reason to round us up as if they were capturing rogue animals.
Mm.
That's what it felt like.
Mm.
I don't have time to describe what it felt like that evening when I was arrested, but suffice it to say, Mrs. Huggins and the Huggins family took my daughter in and took care of her for the whole 2 years that I was incarcerated, 14 months awaiting trial, 6 months on trial. It was, what did I learn? I learned that there are great people in this world, like the lawyers I had. I realized that the judge was a great man because he was the one who declared a mistrial and let us go when the jury locked twice. And I could go into stories about that jury, but I do want to say one thing. Thank goodness for the women on that jury. And it took 3 months to pick the jury. Jury selection is a very crucial, necessary thing. But to find people who would be fair and follow the judge's instructions to give us a fair trial was the most difficult thing. So we ended up with the people we placed on the jury, and I walked free 2 years, 2 days, and some months after being arrested. My daughter was 3 months old when I went to prison, and she was 2.5 when I came home. So there, though, the triumph for me isn't being released 2 years later. The triumph for me was teaching myself to meditate. And I want to say that it's important for us to pause and to breathe in the times that we live in, also at any time. I had no idea that my life would include being incarcerated and in solitary confinement because my words were considered contraband. I couldn't be around any other women without bringing harm to them. They would be isolated if they were found talking to me or writing to me. So, but I met some brave women in prison, and I met some incredible, a couple of incredible prison guards. 2 of them come to the top of my awareness, both women, one Black, one white. So many things about humanity rise to the top of my awareness right now, that there are good people in this world. We have to look for them. We have to align ourselves with them. And we have to consider our own goodness and learn to love ourselves in the midst of the greatest challenges, in the midst of violence all around us and people being frantic about because they're newly aware of racism, structural racism, asking what it is that we should do. We still have to take care of ourselves. We need to pause and breathe. We need to sit still. I'm not talking about the kind of self-care that means you get a massage or a mani-pedi. I'm talking about radical self-care, where you decide for yourself how much you will do in any given day for yourself. It may be 5 minutes. It may be 2 hours. It may be taking a walk. It may be talking to a child, which is what does it for me, or looking into the eyes of a baby, which is so awesome. But it could be more than that. It could be supporting others who are in pain. So those are the things I learned. And I've taught myself to meditate, and I still meditate every single day. And I think I know it's been the anchor of my life, but I also think it has helped me to sustain the work that I do in what someone said is long distance running.
That's that notion of self-care, especially as women, is something we have to be very, very present with, because we are conditioned to care for others before we care for ourselves.
That's right.
And it's very hard to unlearn that language, that conditioning at times, and to feel worthy of the time for yourself, in spite, even though you know that you have to be healthy in order to continue to do the work that you do in the world. But it is hard sometimes to take that time. I'm not saying that men don't have those same issues, but I think as women, that resonates with me as a woman.
I understand you. And then women of color, it's another layer of that.
Mm-hmm.
Because we have been the ones who have worked in the houses, well, before that, the plantations or the residences of other women. And we were also asked to take care of them and their children. And I don't mean just enslaved African women. I mean on an ongoing basis throughout history. Brown women and indigenous women have also had to put themselves in the third tier. And then they would come home, wherever home was, and have to do the same thing at home. Could they? Where was the time for them? So I'm thinking now, when we're in a slower rhythm for some of us, not for all of us, because again, Black and brown folks are out there making the slowdown happen for some people. Mm-hmm. We need to really support ourselves. Maybe it simply is surrounding ourselves with other women who we don't have to take care of, who we can just talk with and cry with and laugh with. So, and it doesn't mean that the women have to be somewhere on the spectrum of queer. They can be women, right? I do this regularly with lots of different groups of people, and it is just such a blessing when I'm in a circle on Zoom and nobody's having to explain themselves. It's such a relief. So I heard someone say, a young Black activist said, "We can breathe." And that meant so much to me, because our breath is intentionally there to give us resilience. It's not there accidentally. You know, our lungs are there on purpose. And so pausing, even a little bit, and not making an excuse for it, just pausing and breathing can make all the difference in a day, or in a life.
Well, thank you for that. We're speaking with Ericka Huggins, an educator, Black Panther Party member, former political prisoner, human rights advocate, and poet, who's been lecturing for 45 years around the world on restorative practices and the role of spiritual practice in creating social change. And I want to turn now to another very important moment in the history of the Black Panther Party, which happened about a year before you and your comrade Bobby Seale were acquitted of the false charges in New Haven. And that happened when, it was specifically August 15th, 1970, Huey P. Newton, who was the co-founder and became the defense minister of the Black Panther Party, who was heterosexual, gave a remarkable speech in New York City, where he outlined the party's position on two movements that were then emerging, the women's liberation movement and the gay liberation movement. Now, until then, the Black Panther Party, while it had publicly opposed sexism, its leaders had never publicly spoken about the question of anti-gay oppression. Huey Newton's speech was later published and distributed widely by the party. And this, again, stood in contrast to the practices, the public positions of virtually every civil rights or Black liberation group at that time. And I just wanted to give listeners a little taste of what Huey Newton said, and then I'll ask our guest, Ericka Huggins, to comment on it. He said, quote, "Whatever your personal opinions and your insecurities about homosexuality and the various liberation movements among homosexuals and women, we should try to unite with them in a revolutionary fashion. We must gain security in ourselves and therefore have respect and feelings for all oppressed people. I know through reading and through life experience and observations that homosexuals are not given freedom and liberty by anyone in the society. They might be the most oppressed people in the society. When we have revolutionary conferences, rallies, and demonstrations, there should be full participation of the gay liberation movement and the women's liberation movement. The terms, quote, faggot and, quote, punk should be deleted from our vocabulary. And especially, we should not attach names normally designed for homosexuals to men who are enemies of the people, such as Nixon or Mitchell, who of course was the Attorney General under Nixon. Homosexuals are not enemies of the people. We should try to form a working coalition with the gay liberation and women's liberation groups," unquote. And again, that was Huey P. Newton, the defense minister of the Black Panther Party at the time. So Ericka Huggins, as someone who was open about who you were, as someone who had relationships with both women and men from the beginning of your time in the Black Panther Party, can you talk about the significance of the speech, both how you felt about it when you first heard it, but also over time? That's almost 50 years ago. What you think it's kind of not only significance to the Black community, but really to the world was and is?
It has great significance because, you know, it reminds me of how happy I was when Kimberly Crenshaw created the term intersectionality. She didn't create it so that academic people can throw it around and use the latest word to describe something. She is in that body with coinciding identities, and so am I. None of us are just one identity. And so what Huey was speaking about was so important to me. That was 1970. I remember reading it because I couldn't see it or hear it while I was incarcerated. And it made me happy because he was talking about the hierarchy of oppressions in a way. And then I'm thinking, and he didn't say it exactly this way, but I've always thought about, excuse me, women of color who are in that spectrum some calls queer. Women of color who are also lesbian. Women of color who are lesbian and have children, like some of the women who were arrested and spent time in prison in New Jersey. So, but we don't think of that as, we don't think of the way that queer people have to defend their lives in the same way as we do white women or Black men who are heterosexual. So Huey was making a profound history-making set of statements. And he was also instructing party members how to behave, because it didn't go to the press first. Comrades got to hear this first. Mm. And I'm saying this because there was pushback from the white gay community in some part of New York about him saying this, because they thought he was doing something. I knew Huey really well. He wasn't doing anything but telling the truth, which he loved to do. And he was right. And I think that when I send people to that article, and I send people to it often, it's also in a book called The Huey P. Newton Reader. Mm-hmm. When I send people to it, they are amazed. They don't know about it. They haven't heard about it. Maybe it could be posted on the Out FM website. But at any rate, we have this notion that because we are Black, no homophobia can be there. Or because we are gay, there can be no racism there. But that's fallacious thinking. That isn't how human beings are put together. We all have these coinciding identities, and some of us are socialized to believe in culture, which includes religion, that there are things that are abominable. So there is nothing abominable about a human being. So I was happy when I heard it. And I think it's still, that essay has great impact today. And I think that it should be part of women, gender, and queer studies on college campuses.
I was taking down some comments you were making at the time and thinking I would love to elaborate on that either today or maybe at another time. Particularly of, queer women's identities within movements, within being in the world, Black women particularly, as we find ourselves in liberation movements, and how do we make space for ourselves to love who we want to and to express it in the ways that we choose to. And so I was wondering. So I was happy to hear you make that comment. I was also wondering if these as we say, LGBTQI plus identities are being established now. If that resonates with you, these multiple identities that that the young people are really establishing.
Yeah, I believe in young people. They're my hope for the whole universe. I'm serious. And I think that intergenerational conversation is quite helpful because everybody can learn something. Well, let me speak for myself. I intend to learn something new until I close my eyes on this life. There is nothing that I want to hold so sacred about myself or others that I can't transform that understanding. So there's a way in which we humans, we get okay with something and then we want it to stay like that. I remember having a conversation with some of my friends who are also lesbian, who were upset about trans women. I go, what? Why? There wasn't any logical reason. There wasn't any heartfelt answer. It was just stuff. But we sat there and had a conversation about it until we worked through whatever inherent biases we had that come with gender, not just sex, but gender, which is an assignment given by birth. Well, what if you're given the wrong assignment at birth? So that was an interesting conversation. It was about 8 years ago. So I think we need to keep talking about what things mean to us. And I'm using queer because I think it kind of says that on Tuesday you might be feeling like this, and on Friday you might be feeling like that, especially if you're young. And then next week you might be feeling another kind of way. I have a dear friend who is an amazing spokesperson for asexuality. I love her. I love talking to her. It reminded me of my celibacy when I was incarcerated. But it didn't mean I didn't want to be touched or loved. We have all these ideas that can be reimagined. And depending on our age, sometimes it gets a little harder. But I push myself. I don't push anybody else, but I push myself to open to what there is to rethink. And I feel like this time under the COVID-19 umbrella is a time for great transformative opportunities to arise if we let them.
Thanks.
Thank you. So if I can just ask one last question,
Sure.
but it's not a small one. It's
You don't have small questions.
no, but it's okay. So Ericka Huggins, I'd like you to look back over the entire period of your involvement in the Black Panther Party and tell us what it felt like as a lesbian, both before Huey Newton made his speech that we just discussed and after. Did you experience, or you had colleagues who were LGBT who experienced bad treatment before that speech? And if so, did that change after the speech? What was the process within the party? And, did you see changes also in the movements that you were working with? And I recognize that at the moment it happened, you were in prison, so you weren't in a good position to really see what was going on on the street level. But from what you could experience at the time, and certainly what you learned once you got out of prison about the conditions in the party and in the larger movement, what are your reflections?
I was never treated in a disrespectful or homophobic way in the Black Panther Party. I was treated a certain way as a woman,
Mm-hmm.
but not because I loved women or loved men. I mean, we didn't spend a lot of time on that kind of thing because, to be honest, Bob, and I think I mentioned this to you earlier, we were busy about staying alive. We all thought we were going to die by the morning. So who we loved was so not the big conversation among us. And there were a number of women who we would say they were lesbian today. And some of them who declared already that they were lesbian. But declarations then weren't as they are now. And I remember that there were men in the party who were somewhere, somehow on the queer spectrum, but I never bothered to ask them. I cared, but I didn't care in that way that sometimes people care.
Mm.
And I don't believe that all of a sudden, with the turn of the 1960s and Malcolm declaring that civil rights are the right you do by law and human rights are the right you do by your very birth, I don't think that there were not people right there with Martin Luther King that wouldn't have identified themselves as queer if they'd been allowed to. Matter of fact, I know there were people there who identified themselves as that way. By the way, I have a dear friend who did his doctoral dissertation on lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and questioning, I think is what he said in his dissertation, this was some years ago, people in Black liberation movements from civil rights all the way forward. And he uncovered so many beautiful things that we don't know in history. We all love Langston Hughes. I love Langston Hughes. My son, who's a poet, loves Langston Hughes. Do our children get to know that he was also gay? No. Because I think societally, like being of color, like being a woman, all these constructed boxes have kept us barriered. So I think that there wasn't something for me in the Black Panther Party, nor any of the women that I knew, or any of the men that I knew. And lots of things came my way by conversation, or the grapevine, but that isn't that never came to me. And partly it could be that for a whole year, after Huey's statement, his speech, as you call it, I was still incarcerated. So we were all about freedom. And it just didn't make sense to any of us to have something that would barrier us from freedom. I don't think we were all that concerned about what people thought about us either, or how we looked. We were just about living our lives to the best of our ability. And some of us were not able to. Some of us died very early.
Well, thank you so much for those profound words. Stamili, do you have a final question?
No, I don't have any more. Well, I have a lot of questions, but
This is your now or never.
Perhaps there'll be another opportunity. Ericka, I hope so.
Well, I hope so.
A lot of questions, yeah.
Sure. And it's been so lovely to meet you.
You as well.
I had no idea who worked for Out FM.
I'm sure. It's an interesting experience, and it's it's wonderful to have the opportunity to speak to someone who, I've admired for most of my life, and I was just really reflecting on as you described the early days in the Panther Party, and I'm sure you hear this a great deal, but I'll just add my own voice. How much it meant to us, those of I was a younger teen at that time, but it was just eye-opening, and it rocked our worlds. I lived in Harlem. I rode the bus down 7th Avenue every day to go to school, past the Panther Party office, and watched it flourish, and then I watched them destroy it. And so we were acutely aware, even though we were young, what was going on in the party. And and if you weren't concerned about how y'all looked, we were. We were all out there looking and commenting and, wondering and thinking, gee, this is a way we could be in the world in so many ways.
A lot of people do say that to us.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget that. I'll just share one thing, because it's how I feel right now in this moment. I have a feeling of gratitude. Thank you for what you said. And one day, there was a documentary film done by Stanley Nelson at Firelight Media called The Black Panther Party, Vanguard of the Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And when it was first released, not when it was first released, but after a few months of its release, there was a special screening of it at the Apollo Theater in Harlem.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always loved that theater for various reasons. It took me a long time to explain why. But suffice it to say that I was on the stage with a moderator who was the daughter of a Black Panther Party member, and members of the Black Panther Party, one of whom was my friend Kathleen Cleaver.
Mm-hmm.
And we were sitting backstage. The curtain was about to go up. And Kathleen looked at me with her big, beautiful smile, and she said, "Ericka, did you ever think we would live to see this day?" And the applause started behind the curtain, and the curtain was rising, and Kathleen and I were sitting there. And my eyes are filling with tears now. No, I didn't think we'd live to see this day. So now that I have this life that I'm grateful for, what am I going to do with it? What am I going to continue to do with it? Hold things in check? Critique all the movements? I can't tell you how honored I was to meet the young queer women who hashtagged and created the Black Lives Matter networks. Mm-hmm. They are amazing. And I was so honored to talk to them. So I keep looking for the good people in the world who want to give their love while they're here. And it's okay to give love where it's most needed in a particular time and a particular place. So yes, I didn't think I would be alive. Mm-hmm. And I'm so grateful that I am alive today to meet you and to reach the ears of the people listening to this show. And I want to thank you, Bob, and thank you, John, and thank you, Stamia.